A man's hand rests on a woman's breast. She does not pull away. Her own hand rises to meet his, fingers loose and unhurried, resting over his knuckles as if to hold the gesture in place rather than stop it. Between them, the paint stops behaving like paint. Her sleeve is not brushed onto the canvas so much as built there, ridge after ridge of gold and ochre standing a good distance off the surface, thick enough to throw its own shadow when the gallery light shifts through the afternoon. Red fills the rest of the fabric, applied so heavily in places that individual strokes still hold the shape of whatever dragged them across the canvas. A palette knife, the wooden end of a brush, perhaps a thumb. The two figures stand close together, lit from the left, their faces turned toward each other with a tenderness that asks nothing of the viewer and explains nothing about who they are. Rembrandt van Rijn painted this sometime around 1665, in the final decade of his life, working out of a rented house on the Rozengracht in Amsterdam for almost no one in particular. He never titled it. As far as the record shows, he never explained who these two people were meant to be. For 150 years after his death, nobody thought to ask. Then a 19th century collector looked at the couple's dress, guessed they might be Jewish, and gave the painting a name that stuck so completely that most visitors now assume Rembrandt chose it himself. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. To understand why a name that was only ever a guess still holds, it helps to know what Rembrandt had already lost by the time he painted it. In 1656, at about the age of 50, he petitioned for what Dutch law called cessio bonorum, a formal surrender of assets that let a debtor avoid the harsher penalties of outright bankruptcy while still losing nearly everything he owned. His house on the Sint-Antoniesbriestraat, purchased at the height of his fame 2 decades earlier for a sum he had never fully paid off, was eventually sold to cover what he owed. His collection went with it. An inventory drawn up before the sale runs to hundreds of items: prints by Dürer, Lucas van Leyden, and Mantegna, suits of Japanese and Turkish armor, shells, minerals, plaster casts of antique sculpture, drawings by artists he had spent a working lifetime studying and copying. It reads less like the estate of a painter than the private museum of a man who had once been the most sought-after portraitist in Amsterdam and had spent according to that reputation without much restraint. By the time the estate was settled, Rembrandt owned almost none of it. He moved to a smaller rented house on the Rozengracht, in a district with none of the prestige of his old address, and kept painting. The city's taste had shifted. His own ability had not. Amsterdam in the 1650s and 60s was a wealthier, more self-consciously fashionable city than the one Rembrandt had arrived in as a young man decades earlier, and its regents and merchants had largely turned toward painters whose work matched that new fashion. Bartholomeus van der Helst was receiving the civic guard commissions and society portraits that had once gone automatically to Rembrandt. Van der Helst's faces are rendered with an evenness of finish that leaves almost no visible trace of the hand that made them, a controlled, glossy surface that reads, even now, as competent, correct, and slightly anonymous, each sitter interchangeable with the next in everything but costume. Rembrandt went the opposite direction entirely. Across the final decade of his working life, in paintings including this one, his own late self-portraits, and group works like the Syndics of the Drapers Guild, his paint grew thicker, rougher, more visibly built rather than smoothly applied. A contemporary Italian traveler who saw his work in this period wrote that Rembrandt's paint had been laid on so heavily in places that a portrait, held up by its nose, could be lifted clean off the ground. It read as a complaint about a painter who had stopped bothering to hide his own process. Rembrandt kept working this way anyway, for a shrinking circle of patrons, students, and admirers who valued something the fashionable style could not offer. Where van der Helst aimed for a surface so even that it disappeared into pure illusion, Rembrandt aimed for paint that stayed present as paint, even at the moment it convinced a viewer it was skin, gold thread, or fur. The materials themselves were nothing unusual for the period. Lead white for the brightest highlights, ochre and vermilion for warmth, bone black and umber for the deep shadow that gives his late faces their weathered gravity. What was unusual was what he did with them, and how much of the work happened while the paint was still wet, rather than in the controlled, dried, translucent glazes that academic training of the period generally recommended for a finished portrait surface. In a passage like the sleeve at the center of this canvas, technical study of Rembrandt's late paintings has repeatedly described a working method that treated pigment less like a coating to be spread evenly across a surface and more like a material to be built and shaped directly on the canvas, pushed, dragged, and scored, while it still held the mark of whatever tool had moved it. Some of that material evidence has become considerably more specific in recent years. Conservation scientists working with paint samples from several of Rembrandt's late canvases have used a particle accelerator, a synchrotron light source capable of resolving the crystalline structure of individual paint grains far more precisely than a conventional laboratory microscope, to analyze exactly what his heaviest impasto passages are made of. What they found went beyond lead white applied thickly. In some samples, the lead in the paint had partly transformed, likely through a deliberate step in how Rembrandt or his workshop prepared the medium, into a rare, dense crystalline compound called Plumbonacrite, a lead carbonate that gives paint a distinctive stiffness and body once it dries, useful for exactly the kind of raised sculptural mark this sleeve depends on. It is a compound that chemistry would not formally isolate and describe in a laboratory setting until long after Rembrandt's death. He appears to have arrived at something close to it through trial, practice, and an unrecorded studio recipe, without ever knowing what the chemistry books would eventually call it. In 1885, a Dutch painter, who had not yet sold a single canvas in his lifetime, stood in front of this work in Amsterdam and could not make himself leave. Vincent van Gogh had traveled there partly to see his family, and partly, by his own account, to look again and again at paintings he had previously known only from reproductions and second-hand description. He wrote to his brother Theo that he would give 10 years of his own life to sit for 2 weeks in front of this particular canvas with nothing to eat but a crust of dry bread. It is one of the most quoted lines in the history of Dutch painting, usually repeated as a piece of color, an example of Van Gogh's intensity, without much attention paid to what he was actually responding to. What he described sounds less like a pleasant museum afternoon, and more like recognition. Van Gogh had already begun trying, in his own uneven early work, to make paint carry more physical weight than conventional description usually asks of it, loading his brush the way he had seen Dutch painters of an earlier generation do, in reproductions and in the museums he had started to frequent. Standing in front of this canvas, he found someone who had already solved the problem he was only beginning to pose, and had solved it 2 centuries earlier, with none of the vocabulary that would later exist to describe what had been done. The timing of that visit was not incidental. Van Gogh had arrived in Amsterdam in the autumn of 1885, only months after the death of his father, a rural pastor whose disapproval of his son's abandoned career in art dealing, and later in ministry, had shadowed most of Van Gogh's adult life. The two men had argued often and bitterly, and Van Gogh had spent the years leading up to his father's death working in relative isolation in the Dutch countryside, largely supported by Theo, largely unsold, and largely unconvinced by his own early work even as he kept producing it. The trip to Amsterdam was partly practical, arranged around family matters following the death, and partly a chance to spend concentrated time in front of paintings he had mostly known only through black and white reproductions and the second-hand descriptions of critics. He was, by his own account in letters from this period, hungry for exactly this kind of direct encounter, aware that reproduction flattened precisely the quality in Dutch painting he was most trying to understand, the physical behavior of paint under real light rather than its behavior as a fixed printed image. What he found in front of this canvas was confirmation that the problem he had been circling in his own studio, how to make paint carry weight rather than only depict it, had already been solved, decisively, by a painter working in the same city 2 centuries earlier, under conditions of professional failure rather than professional triumph. That detail seems to have mattered to Van Gogh as much as the technical solution itself. Rembrandt had not built this sleeve as a young man at the height of fashionable demand, when caution about market taste might reasonably have kept his methods conservative. He had built it after losing almost everything the market had once given him, at a point in his career when a fashionable outcome was no longer even available to aim for. For a painter like Van Gogh, still years from any recognition of his own, and already prone to reading his own difficulties as confirmation of failure rather than the ordinary cost of an unfashionable direction, that sequence, ruin first and breakthrough after, seems to have offered something closer to permission than instruction. What Van Gogh could not walk away from is the same detail this canvas withholds until a viewer gets close enough to see it properly. What looks, from across a gallery, like heavily worked gold cloth resolves, at close range, into something closer to a low relief carved directly into the paint itself. The ridges of pigment on the sleeve stand high enough off the canvas to catch raking light unevenly, exactly the way real embroidered thread would catch it unevenly, throwing small individual shadows rather than one smooth reflective plane. Walk toward the painting, and the sleeve stops reading as fabric at all. It becomes a field of ridges and troughs, close to abstract, almost unrecognizable as clothing. Walk back to a normal viewing distance and it reassembles itself into cloth so convincing that visitors across several centuries, not only Van Gogh, have described wanting to reach out and check whether it is actually raised off the surface, which of course it is. Rembrandt's late style did not go unnoticed by his own contemporaries, and what notice it received was rarely kind. One of the few surviving accounts of his working method during this period comes at second hand, filtered through the recollections of a former student, and later set down by an Italian biographer compiling lives of northern painters for a European audience. According to that account, Rembrandt was in the habit of declaring a painting finished at the moment he judged his own intention for the picture had been achieved, regardless of how rough the surface remained, rather than waiting until every detail had been resolved to a conventional standard of polish. Visitors were warned, in some versions of the story, not to breathe too close to certain passages, since the paint sat proud enough of the canvas that it might still be tacky years after it was applied. Whether or not every detail of the anecdote survives intact, it points to something real. Rembrandt's late manner registered, to eyes trained on the period's dominant taste, as a kind of provocation, an insistence on an unfinished-looking surface that a fashionable patron would have every reason to reject. He was not entirely alone in this. Frans Hals, working in Haarlem into his own old age and dying 2 years before Rembrandt, underwent a comparable late shift toward looser, more visibly worked brushwork, faces built from strokes that read as gesture at close range and resolve into likeness only at a distance. Hals, like Rembrandt, saw his commissions dwindle as he aged, and spent his final years in reduced circumstances, dependent at points on municipal charity. The two painters left no record of direct exchange, but their late careers trace a similar arc. Technical ambition increasing as market demand for it collapsed. Public taste moving decisively toward the kind of smooth, legible finish that both men were abandoning at precisely the moment their late styles matured into something considerably harder to sell. What set Rembrandt's late impasto apart, even from Hals, was the degree to which he treated paint as a physical, sculptural material rather than only a gestural one. Hals's late brushwork stays close to the surface, rapid strokes of paint still applied thinly enough to dry flat. Rembrandt's built upward, layer over layer, until passages like the sleeve in this canvas project measurably off the canvas plane, catching and interrupting real light rather than only describing it. The workshop that had once trained dozens of students capable of producing paintings close enough to his own manner to be sold, in some documented cases, under his name, had by this point largely dispersed. Earlier accounts of Netherlandish painting describe a much younger Rembrandt at the center of a bustling studio economy, pupils queued to learn under him and paying well for the privilege. By the 1660s, that economy belonged to other painters. What remained for Rembrandt was the studio itself, a shrinking list of private commissions, and, on the evidence of a canvas like this one, an increasingly private and technically demanding argument with his own materials. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Rembrandt was working an optical principle that would not be studied and formally named for a long time afterward, the way physical surface relief interacts with directional light to simulate a texture and material the eye cannot fully resolve at a normal viewing distance. Painters of his own period, trained to prize a smooth, evenly lit finish, generally treated heavy impasto as a technical shortcoming, to be minimized rather than a tool to be developed on purpose. It would not become a deliberately embraced expressive method, something artists reached for rather than apologized for, until the closing decades of the 19th century, when painters including Van Gogh himself began building up paint for precisely this reason, to let the surface itself carry emotional and physical weight rather than simply depict an object from one idealized, static angle. Van Gogh recognized the trick standing in front of this canvas because he was actively trying to reinvent it in his own studio. He did not yet know that a bankrupt Dutchman working alone in a rented house on the Rozengracht had already had more than 2 centuries' head start on solving it. The surface is only half of what this canvas is doing. Infrared examination and X-radiography of Rembrandt's late portraits, including work from this same period of his career, have repeatedly shown a painter who kept revising well past the point where a less demanding artist would have called a composition finished. Beneath passages that look, on the surface, like a single, confident and spontaneous gesture, imaging of comparable late canvases has revealed earlier positions for hands, earlier angles for a turned head, adjustments made and then painted over, rather than corrected on a fresh canvas. The picture we see is not a first thought preserved under varnish. It is closer to a final decision, arrived at only after several earlier ones had been tried, judged insufficient, and buried beneath the layer that a 19th century viewer would later mistake, understandably, for pure spontaneity. This canvas is not an isolated case within Rembrandt's final years. His late self-portraits, painted across this same decade, show the identical willingness to keep working a passage past the point of conventional resolution. The paint on his own face in works like the self-portrait now held at Kenwood House in London, built up in comparably thick, worked ridges around the eyes and forehead, a record of a man studying his own aging features with the same physical, sculptural method he was applying to fabric and flesh elsewhere. An artist repeating a demanding technical approach across self-portraits nobody had commissioned, made for no market and no patron beyond his own continuing curiosity about what paint could do, is difficult to reconcile with the picture of a man simply making do with a manner he had grown too old or too stubborn to abandon. The self-portraits have no audience to please. He kept building the paint up anyway. And then there is the harder question, the one the painting's popular nickname forecloses, rather than answers, who these two people actually are. The title by which the world knows this work was never Rembrandt's own. It appears to trace back to a Parisian collector and dealer cataloguing the picture in the 1820s, who, working from the couple's clothing rather than any documented identification, described them simply as a Jewish couple exchanging vows or receiving a blessing. The guess became the title, and the title outlived the guess so completely that most visitors now walk past assuming Rembrandt himself had named it that. Later art historians, working less from costume and more from gesture and composition, proposed a considerably older subject drawn from Dutch religious painting of the period, the biblical account of Isaac and Rebekah, told in the 26th chapter of the book of Genesis, in which the Philistine king Abimelech happens to look out of his window and catches the two of them in an embrace they had been trying to conceal, since Isaac had told the local population that Rebekah was his sister rather than his wife, fearing for his own safety among strangers who might otherwise kill him to take her. Earlier Dutch depictions of this same story sometimes include a distant figure framed in a window, watching unseen. This canvas includes, far in its background, an architectural form faint enough that most viewers never register it as anything more than atmospheric backdrop, but specific enough in outline that some scholars have read it as exactly that watching figure, transplanted into a scene that no longer announces its biblical source out loud. Neither reading can be settled from the surviving archive alone, and it is worth naming that gap directly rather than resolving it for the sake of a tidier story. Rembrandt left no letter explaining his intentions for this canvas, no inventory entry naming the sitters, no preparatory sketch carrying an identifying caption. What can be said with more confidence is that, whichever story he had in mind, sacred history reworked as contemporary genre painting, or an actual couple who commissioned a double portrait he never finished delivering, or never fully got paid for, he built the composition around an embrace that is observed rather than performed for an audience. Neither figure looks outward, neither seems aware of being watched, even as the picture's own quiet architectural detail suggests that, within its fiction, someone else may be. That sense of privacy, of two people caught inside a moment that was never staged for a viewer, sits at the emotional center of the composition, no matter which biblical or contemporary story supplied its original occasion, and it may be the real reason the inaccurate 19th century title has proven so difficult to dislodge. It described a feeling the painting produces, even while getting the facts of it wrong. Taken together, the surface and everything sitting underneath it argue for something more specific than a general claim about late career mastery, the kind of vague praise attached to any famous old man's final decade, regardless of what the paint is actually doing. This canvas is evidence of an artist working, deliberately and more than once, on a technical problem that most of his contemporaries were not attempting to solve at all: how to make paint hold and redirect physical light the way the object it depicts would hold and redirect physical light, rather than simply describing that object from one fixed, flattering, idealized angle under one imagined light source. The polished school aimed for a surface so even it disappeared entirely, leaving only the illusion behind it intact. Rembrandt aimed for a surface that never fully disappeared, that stayed stubbornly present as paint, even while it convinced a viewer it was gold thread, skin, and breath. Combined with the buried revisions the imaging reveals, evidence of a composition still being actively negotiated, well into its execution, rather than settled from the first sitting, and combined with a paint chemistry that modern science can now describe in terms Rembrandt himself never had access to, the picture reads less like a confident final flourish from a painter with nothing left to prove, and more like an ongoing, unfinished experiment that happened to stop only because the painter eventually did. The bankruptcy had cost Rembrandt his house, his collection of prints and armor and antique casts, and most of his fashionable clientele. It did not cost him this. The account of his final years that circulated among contemporaries who preferred the polished style was a story of decline, an old man clinging stubbornly to an outdated manner because he had nothing else left to offer a city that had moved on without him. The technical evidence sitting inside a canvas like this one argues against that story rather than for it. A painter in genuine artistic decline does not spend real time reworking the exact placement of a hand that no one looking at the finished picture would ever know had once been somewhere else. He does not, apparently working alone and without any documented external encouragement, arrive at a paint chemistry and application method that anticipates by well over 2 centuries a formal vocabulary later painters would need entire movements, manifestos, and exhibitions to properly rediscover and defend. What the ruin of 1656 actually cost Rembrandt was his market. It did not cost him the underlying problem he was still trying to solve, which was never primarily about flattering a sitter's likeness. It was about making paint behave the way light and matter actually behave, rather than the way a fashionable portrait was expected to describe them. This is what Van Gogh appears to have understood, standing in front of the canvas in 1885, decades before he would build his own short and largely unrecognized career on paint, applied thickly enough to cast real shadows across a real canvas surface. This went beyond reverence for the institution old masters occupy inside a museum. He was recognizing, more specifically, a fellow painter who had already run an experiment Van Gogh was only beginning to attempt himself, and who had run it under considerably worse conditions, stripped of patronage, largely written off by the fashionable taste of his own city, for an audience that had mostly stopped paying close attention by the time he finished it. The 10 years and the crust of dry bread were not simply exaggeration offered for color, they were the closest available language for describing what it costs to encounter, decades or centuries after the fact, someone who had already solved, privately and without much acknowledgement at the time, a problem you had assumed belonged uniquely to your own generation to even ask. None of this required Rembrandt to think of himself as reinventing anything. The praise later biographers reached for, when they reached for it at all, was usually reserved for facility, for the visible ease with which a painter could produce a convincing likeness. What this canvas demonstrates instead is a slower, more stubborn kind of intelligence, the sort that shows itself only in decisions nobody at the time was in a position to notice. A hand repositioned under a layer no patron would ever see, a pigment mixture worked and reworked until it held a shape no standard formula guaranteed, a surface built specifically to reward a viewer willing to move close and then step back again, rather than one designed to satisfy at a single fixed distance the way a fashionable portrait was expected to. That kind of intelligence rarely announces itself. It survives, when it survives at all, in the physical evidence a painting leaves behind for whoever eventually develops the tools to look closely enough, whether that tool is a synchrotron beam 3 centuries later or simply a young, unrecognized painter standing near enough to a canvas to notice that the gold was never paint pretending to be gold. It was paint behaving, on purpose, like something that could catch and hold real light the way gold actually does. Measured against that standard, the ruin that ended Rembrandt's fashionable career looks less like the end of the story this painting has to tell, and more like the condition that made the rest of it possible, a forced departure from a market that had never much wanted this kind of intelligence in the first place. The painting hangs today in the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam, a short walk from the Night Watch, inside a museum that receives millions of visitors a year, the great majority of whom pass this particular canvas more quickly than the 2 people painted inside it ever appear to be moving. It remains in generally stable condition and continues to be a subject of ongoing technical study, as the imaging and analytical methods available to conservators keep improving well beyond what existed even 1 generation ago, each new pass finding a little more sitting beneath a surface that already refuses to hold still under close looking. Nobody has ever conclusively identified the couple, Nobody has fully explained why an artist with almost nothing left to prove to Amsterdam society kept reworking a picture that no surviving patron appears to have been standing over his shoulder, demanding he finish. What survives, in the meantime, is the object itself. Paint still standing physically off nearly 3.5 centuries of canvas, still catching gallery light differently, depending on exactly where a visitor happens to be standing, still performing a trick that Rembrandt built into the surface long before anyone had developed the vocabulary needed to properly describe what the trick was, or to give the two people wearing it a name that might actually be their own. Paint built this thickly carries its own long-term risk, one that the conservators monitoring the picture take seriously. Impasto of this depth ages unevenly compared to the thin, level layers of a conventionally finished portrait, and the ridges most responsible for the sleeve's illusion of gold thread are also the passages most vulnerable to the fine surface cracking, known as craquelure, that develops as oil paint contracts over centuries, along with the risk of small losses if paint at the very tip of a ridge grows brittle enough to shed. Keeping a canvas like this stable means monitoring exactly the passages that make it remarkable in the first place, a maintenance problem that a smoother, more conventionally finished portrait from the same period would never present in quite the same way. Van Gogh's own late canvases, built from paint applied with comparable physical ambition, would go on to present conservators with much the same dilemma a century later, the same thick ridges that give his sunflowers and cypresses their charge, also proving to be the passages most prone to flattening, cracking, or loss over time. The problem he recognized standing in front of Rembrandt's sleeve in 1885, wanting paint to carry more than description usually asked of it, turned out to be the same problem his own late work would eventually generate for the people trying to keep it intact, which makes the crust of dry bread a gesture of admiration and, in hindsight, an early sign of a difficulty he was already on his way to inheriting. Stand close enough to the sleeve, and it stops looking like fabric altogether, resolving instead into something closer to a small landscape, ridged and cratered, barely readable as clothing at all. Step back to where a Renaissance eye or a modern one is meant to stand, and it reassembles itself into cloth rich enough that a 60-year-old man who had lost his house, his collection, and most of his standing in the only city he had ever really worked in, seems, for one unbroken passage of paint, to have already solved a problem the rest of art history would spend the following 2 centuries working out how to properly ask. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.